piercing November chill had crept into every corner of the old wooden house, wrapping everything in its icy breath. Even outside, under the grey sky, might have seemed cosier than here, in this derelict, long, abandoned dwelling. Cheap, faded wallpaper hung in shreds from the walls, pathetic furniture, creaking floors, dust and desolation everywhere. Clara shivered, placed her overstuffed bag on a rickety chair, and approached the tin stove in the corner. A few split logs lay nearby. "Thank you, Grandpa," Clara whispered. "You saved these for me. At least I can get warm now." She was ready to talk to her grandfather, who had died 4 years ago, to seek his help and protection. There was simply no one else to turn to. But her grandpa wouldn't answer and couldn't help her. Just 2 weeks ago, Clara had considered herself the happiest girl in the world, and today she found herself in a forgotten, God-forsaken village, in an abandoned, cold house, and she was lucky to have even found such a refuge. Clara found a half-full box of matches and a stack of yellowed newspapers in a cupboard. She started a fire in the stove. It was a familiar task. A crumpled sheet of newspaper readily flared up. Then the logs slowly caught fire. Clara squatted by the stove, holding her frozen hands close to the flames. Tears flowed from her eyes incessantly. Sobbing tightened her throat. She cried for a long time, for there was absolutely no one to comfort her. But then, somehow, the tears stopped. Clara gradually calmed down. The flames flickered in the stove. The logs crackled softly. At least, she could hope that it would get warmer in the house soon. Thankfully, the place was small. Outside, it had long been dark. Black shadows filled the corners of the room. Clara stood up and flicked the light switch. The bulb in the lampshade didn't light up. She went into the other room and confirmed the light didn't work there either, although the bulbs themselves weren't burnt out. Nothing surprising, everything in the house was practically falling apart. She would have to figure out how to fix this problem tomorrow, but for tonight, she would have to spend the rest of the evening in the dark. Clara only just remembered that she hadn't eaten anything since breakfast, and a soft-boiled egg and a processed cheese sandwich could hardly be considered a proper breakfast anyway. It was hard to believe that recently she had been sitting in an expensive restaurant with her fiancé, browsing the menu for an original dessert she hadn't tried before, and a polished waiter with a practiced smile stood by the table, waiting for their order. The comfortable life had quickly become normal, for one gets used to good things instantly. Clara found a rag and wiped the dust off the table. She took a bag with a couple of pastries bought at the bus station and a bottle of water from her bag. She had a quick bite, although she wasn't hungry at all. But there was nothing else to do in the almost complete darkness. She decided to tidy up the house and settle in the morning. Around 9 o'clock, she went into what used to be her room, curled up on top of the dust-scented blanket without undressing. She thought she would fall asleep immediately after the long journey. However, sleep didn't come. Her mind kept replaying recent and distant events. She had left this remote village, where she grew up, with joy. There was nothing particularly appealing for a young girl here. The young people tried to move to the city as soon as possible. Mostly elderly people remained in the village. Her grandpa had taken in his 6-year-old granddaughter after her parents died in an accident and raised her as best he could. But he always insisted she must get excellent grades, go to university, and make a life for herself in the city. Clara managed to get into university on a scholarship. While studying, she would visit the village occasionally, trying to spend time with her grandpa more often. Truth be told, these trips weren't always pleasant. Grandpa liked to drink, and there was no denying he was hitting the bottle more often each year. But he was her only relative. Besides, even when he was drunk, her grandpa wasn't nagging or aggressive, so Clara continued to visit him. The news of his sudden death was a real shock. Clara wasn't prepared for it. It was terrifying to be completely alone in the world. After the funeral, she locked up the empty house and had only visited a couple of times since then. Life in the city hadn't gone too well either. Clara successfully graduated from university, but who needed a young art historian with a first-class degree? Right, no one. At least not in the city where Clara lived. Employers were unwelcoming. Everyone needed pushy sales managers, and a shy girl who had worked part-time in a museum or library during her studies wasn't interesting as an employee. A temporary job at a company where Clara was covering for someone on maternity leave ended. The dorm still allowed her to stay for now, but the manager made it clear it was time to leave. And just when Clara was almost despairing, she was invited for an interview at a large construction company. CityBuild was looking for an executive assistant for the CEO. They had seen her resume online. Clara didn't really hope for success, and she had no experience. But she went to the interview at the appointed time anyway. She wasn't the only candidate. 3 other girls were waiting in the reception area for the same position. Judging by their conversations, the others had secretarial experience, so Clara already felt she had come for nothing. To her surprise, the HR manager was pleasant and welcoming. He said that lack of experience wasn't that important, and when she saw the CEO, it felt like a miracle had happened. He captivated her at first sight, the man of her dreams, from a different, successful, interesting life. She had only seen him in her dreams. The girl blushed, lowered her eyes, and could barely answer a couple of standard questions. However, Clara's awkwardness during the short interview with the CEO didn't hurt her chances. On the contrary, 2 days later, the HR manager called and asked if she could start tomorrow. Of course, Clara happily agreed. She ironed her only business suit and was at the office half an hour before the start of the workday the next morning. She was very nervous that she wouldn't be able to handle the unfamiliar duties, but everything went more or less smoothly. The girl Clara was replacing willingly helped her out at first, showed the newcomer the ropes, and taught her everything. She was leaving because she was moving to another city. Julian Sterling, the CEO, would look into the reception area from time to time, and he was always very friendly. Clara settled into the company without any problems, despite her usual shyness and introversion. She quickly got to know all the employees. She even made friends with some. She tried to get involved in the company's affairs as quickly as possible. She came early, left late, and often skipped lunch breaks, all for Julian to be pleased. She wanted to become his indispensable assistant. Overall, that's how it worked out. She really did become an excellent executive assistant. But Clara also became the mistress of her charming boss. This happened 6 months later. Julian gradually started showing interest in her. Clara blossomed before his eyes, dressed better, changed her hairstyle, and became skilled at using makeup. She flew to work every day as if it were a holiday. She felt that her boss liked her. And just before the new year, during the corporate party, Julian couldn't take his eyes off her. Of course, he couldn't only pay attention to her. Their office romance began from then on. Despite moments when Julian showed some not-so-great sides of his character, Clara was on cloud 9. She loved her boss with all her heart. Soon he visited her home, a tiny one-room apartment on the outskirts that Clara had recently rented. Naturally, Julian didn't like this place, with its Soviet-era furniture and worn carpet on the wall. What a dump! You know what, baby? I'll rent you a decent apartment myself. You can make a cosy little nest for us there. Meeting at my place isn't always convenient. 3 days later, Clara moved into a small but modern and fully furnished apartment near the city centre. Julian also bought Clara fashionable clothes, expensive lingerie, gave her some gold jewellery, and offered to pay for visits to a beauty salon. My woman should look decent, like a queen. Clara tried her best to look presentable so that her boss could be proud of her. They occasionally went to presentations, premieres, and social events together. One time, Julian took her to the seaside for 2 weeks. It was a real fairy tale. Her father drove a truck. Her mother worked on the nearest farm from their village. When Clara was small, the family moved to the city, where her father became a bus driver, and her mother a grocery store clerk. For the summer, Clara was sent to her grandpa for fresh air. They went by bus to visit her on a weekend and got into an accident. Such was fate. Clara didn't quite understand why she needed to invent stories about her parents. However, she didn't argue. Just you do it. I'm not good at lying convincingly. Agreed, it's not lying. Nobody was interested in her opinion anyway. The only thing they allowed her to do herself was choose her wedding dress. However, she chose from several models recommended by her future mother-in-law. Clara chose a dress of fabulous beauty with hand embroidery, a full skirt, and a corseted waist. She could afford such a model. Her pregnancy was very early, so none of the guests would guess the bride was pregnant. They didn't need to wait a month for the civil ceremony. And don't you dare complain to the Labour Inspectorate or anywhere else. Otherwise, you'll be fired with cause, so I wouldn't push your luck. Clara felt like she was in a terrible nightmare. She would wake up now, open her eyes, and everything would go back to normal. Julian would be his old self, the nightmare would disappear, and everything would be fine between them. However, the nightmare continued in reality. Julian watched her movements around the apartment closely, as if he suspected her of trying to take someone else's property. Clara got dressed and tied her hair back in a ponytail. Ready? All right, out you go, Julian said. There was one last hope. Wait, what about the baby? Clara pleaded. You can't abandon him. Why are you doing this to me? This is some kind of misunderstanding. Let's talk. There's nothing to talk about, he snapped. And the baby? I don't care who you conceived him with. I'm not going to support someone else's child. Find another idiot. Unexpectedly, Clara found the strength to resist. How much longer could he torment her? She had the right to at least know what had happened. The day before, they had parted as usual after work. Julian had driven her home, and then he had gone about his business. Everything was peaceful and calm. Nothing had foretold such a storm. I won't leave until you explain what happened. Clara sank into an armchair and crossed her arms over her chest. Julian just smirked. I knew you'd cling to me. Fine, you asked for it. He left the apartment into the hallway and returned barely half a minute later, accompanied by two grim-looking bodyguards. See this girl out of my apartment. Don't forget to leave the keys. The lease is in my name, so you're surplus to requirements here. One of the bodyguards grabbed her arm. Suddenly, Julian said, Hold it! 1 second. It seemed like he was about to burst out laughing. Sorry, darling, it was a joke. Did you actually believe it? However, Julian added, Give me back the ring. The ring sparkled on her ring finger with 3 stones. Stylish, understated, but very expensive. Julian had chosen it at a jewellery store on the city's main street. Are you deaf? Julian asked irritably. Clara pulled the ring from her finger. Who could she turn to for help? She had no relatives or close friends. Her university friends had moved away, and there weren't many of them anyway. Only one former classmate, Jessica, remained in the city. Clara headed to her place. Fortunately, Jessica was home. However, she was in a terrible mood. Their department had been sent on a 2-week unpaid leave the day before, so they were facing money problems. The company where she worked as a copywriter might go bankrupt soon. And now, a friend she hadn't spoken to in ages suddenly showed up in tears with a bag in her hands. I warned you that Julian wasn't good for you, Jessica said, seating Clara at the table and putting a cup of tea in front of her. I saw him a couple of times, a puffed-up turkey. There's nothing good about him except his millions. He's not puffed up, Clara sobbed. Before, he was so good. He took such good care of me. I just can't believe it's over. And this is just before the wedding. Where do I go now? Of course, I won't go to work anymore since I was fired. But what an idiot! They can't just fire you like that, especially when you're pregnant. Although, since the owner of the company decided, they'll get rid of you anyway. Okay, you can stay with me for a while, and then we'll see. But you can see I'm having problems too right now, so expenses will be split. Clara gratefully agreed. However, living in someone else's apartment wasn't easy at all. The very next day, Jessica started making sarcastic remarks, as if she didn't notice how much she was hurting her friend. That's what happens when you fly too high. You have to fall back to earth. You probably weren't even planning to invite me to the wedding, were you? No, that's not true. I definitely would have invited you. Clara wasn't being entirely honest here. She herself wanted to invite Jessica as a bridesmaid, but Julian was strongly against it. She'll spoil everything once she makes friends. She has no place at our wedding. My cousin will be your bridesmaid. Clara had agreed back then. She never argued with Julian, although she couldn't even imagine how she would justify it to Jessica later. If only she had known in advance that the wedding would fall through anyway. Clara had very little money left. She had spent practically everything on her wedding dress and shoes, and the second card, which Julian occasionally put money on, was blocked. The luxurious dress remained in the closet, along with the rest of the expensive things she no longer had access to. And Jessica wouldn't let up. Why didn't you save money while you had the chance? Can you really trust men? And now you're left with nothing. Clara herself had already realised how impractical and naive she had been. However, it was too late to fix it. Oh, Clara, what a simpleton you are. You lost your fiancé. It's your own fault. You let him walk all over you. That's why he got away with it. If I were you, I wouldn't have allowed that. Frankly, Jessica was theorising purely. Her own relationship history was rather pathetic. During university, 2 short romances ended almost as soon as they began, and nothing else had materialised. But who would miss the chance to criticise a friend who had been lucky until recently? Clara wanted to say that Jessica probably wouldn't have been able to control Julian, but she didn't dare to argue. She only replied, "That's just how it turned out." "Maybe try approaching his parents," her friend suggested. "Maybe they don't know that their son kicked you out. You said they wanted grandchildren and were rushing the wedding." Clara also thought it was worth a try. She remembered the address. One day she gathered her courage and went to the Sterling's country house by taxi. Sadly, the trip was fruitless. She rang the doorbell for a long time, but no one answered. The wrought iron gates remained closed. Clara was about to go back when a security guard approached the solid metal fence. "They told us they don't want to see you here anymore." "But why?" "I really need to talk to Mr. and Mrs. Sterling. Please let me through." "I've already told you everything. Leave, or I'll have to take action. This is private property." That was the end of the conversation. Under the security guard's stern gaze, Clara got into the taxi. She had to go back, without even seeing her potential parents-in-law. All the way back, Clara felt like the taxi driver was looking at her with curiosity and a smirk. Of course, he had witnessed the unpleasant scene at the gate. She was very embarrassed in front of a stranger. However, this was far from the biggest problem. She urgently needed to find a job to have some source of income. Clara hoped to find a new job quickly. She managed to go to several interviews. In another situation, her work experience at a large successful company would have been useful. However, now she had to answer probing questions from HR managers. "Why did you leave your previous job? Can you provide references from your former employer?" Clara would blush and stumble, knowing that this only harmed her chances. Some HR managers told her directly that they had already checked her references and she had been painted in the darkest possible colours by her previous employer. According to the feedback about Clara, she was a terrible employee. Constant absenteeism, conflicts, lying, and she even stole office supplies. "Miss, with such references, no decent company will hire you," one HR manager said. "But how? I'm not to blame," Clara mumbled. But it was difficult to prove now. At first, she thought her former boss's influence couldn't extend across the entire city. However, wherever she applied, she was rejected. "You need to find a job somewhere urgently," Jessica reminded her after another failed interview. "It's okay now. Nobody suspects you're pregnant. But later, it will be noticeable. Who will hire you for a new job with a bump? So don't wait. Grab any vacancy." "I can't wait," Clara replied, and sent her resume for the next job posting. Now she was willing to work as a bus conductor or a cleaner, just to start earning money again. As luck would have it, even these humble positions were hard to get at that moment. For some reason, nothing was working out. The situation got even worse. One rainy, gloomy day, Jessica was gone for about 3 hours. She returned in the darkest mood. She silently took off her raincoat and wet boots, went to the kitchen, and put on the kettle. Then she cut the wafer cake she had brought and invited Clara to the table. She pushed a saucer with a piece of cake towards her and said, "I have bad news, friend. Our company is closing down. There was a staff meeting today. They promised, of course, to pay severance, but I doubt it. In short, I'm unemployed too now." "Well, then we'll look for jobs together," Clara replied. "That way it will be more fun. Something is bound to come up." "No, I have other plans. I'm going to rent out my apartment, and for now, I'll temporarily move in with my parents. It will be cramped, but I'll manage somehow. I'll probably move to Moscow next month. I have an aunt there. Not long ago, she had travelled around the city in Julian's luxurious silver car, in its natural leather interior, or she would call a taxi. And now she had to count and recount the rubles for her trolleybus fare. How quickly the familiar, prosperous life had crumbled. Clara got off at the right stop and walked down the street trying to avoid puddles. She regretted 100 times that she hadn't asked Jessica for an umbrella. At least her jacket had a hood. Clara was approaching the office building when a departing car splashed her with mud. She recognised the blue Opel. It belonged to Marcus, Julian's deputy. He splashed her from head to toe and drove on, as if nothing had happened, off to his urgent business. He didn't even notice. And before, Marcus had generously showered Clara with compliments and tried to be charming. Clara easily slipped past the security guard at the entrance. She was afraid that the security here had also been instructed not to let the former employee through. But everything was fine. Clara decided it was a good sign and felt a little encouraged. She went up to the second floor, which was entirely occupied by City Build. She didn't meet anyone in the hallway and entered the reception area without hindrance. The place had a new occupant. A beautiful young blonde was sitting at Clara's old desk. She was tapping on the keyboard with her manicured fingers. Seeing the visitor, she looked up from her work. "Hello," she said pleasantly. "Good afternoon. Are you here to see Julian Sterling? He's not here right now, but I'd be happy to help you." He had found a replacement for Clara quickly. The position of executive assistant hadn't remained vacant for long. Clara was annoyed to admit that the new assistant made a very pleasant impression. However, the fact remained. The girl was exceptionally attractive and had a friendly demeanour. Clara's throat tightened, but she tried to speak as calmly as possible. "I used to work in your position. I've come to pick up my things." The blonde stared at her with undisguised curiosity. "No one told me about your things. Let me ask one of the employees. Could you call Tatiana from accounting? She knows me well." "I'll call now." The blonde found the right number and asked Tatiana on the phone to come to the reception. Clara had often talked to Tatiana and considered her, if not a friend, then an acquaintance. They often had coffee together and chatted about trivial things, discussing company news and personal matters. Tatiana appeared soon. She seemed slightly embarrassed. She avoided looking Clara in the eye. "Oh, hi, how are you? I took your things to my office. Here, please take them. Everything is safe and sound." Tatiana was holding a box from office paper. Together with Clara, she started transferring the few items into a bag. Of course, Clara was eager to question her acquaintance. She surely knew something. Only the presence of the newcomer was a hindrance. But Clara hoped to talk without witnesses somewhere in the hallway, and then Julian himself walked into the reception area. He instantly darted past the stunned Clara into his office and slammed the door shut. The sound of a key turning in the lock was heard. Naturally, Clara rushed to the locked door. "Julian!" "Open up!" Silence in response. "Open up now! Do you hear me?" Tatiana retreated to the far corner, but the blonde rushed.